The year is approximately 1200 BCE. Across the Mediterranean, the greatest civilizations on Earth are thriving. Egypt rules from the Nile with wealth beyond imagination. The Hittite Empire commands central Anatolia with iron discipline. Mycenaean Greece builds palaces glittering with gold. Merchant ships move constantly between these powers, carrying tin, copper, ivory, and grain. Kings write letters to one another, calling each other brother. This is a connected world, a wealthy world, a world that believes it will last forever. Then, within the span of a few decades, it doesn't. Cities burn, palaces are abandoned mid-meal, their storerooms full and their doors left open. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries simply disappear from the historical record. Trade routes that once linked 3 continents go silent. And in the wreckage, ancient scribes leave behind fragments of terror, all pointing to one name: the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Raiders who came from nowhere to tear down the ancient world? Refugees fleeing a catastrophe of their own kind? Mercenaries caught up in a war too big for any one kingdom to survive? Or something else entirely? A symptom of a collapse that was already underway. More than 3,000 years later, historians are still trying to answer that question. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why it might be one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in ancient history. To understand how staggering this collapse really was, you first have to understand what was lost. In the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned almost like a single interconnected economy. Egypt, under pharaohs like Ramesses II, controlled vast wealth in gold and grain. The Hittite Empire, based in what is now Turkey, rivaled Egypt militarily and had fought them to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh before signing what may be history's oldest surviving peace treaty. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon and the legends that would later become Homer's epics, thrived on trade and tribute. Cyprus supplied copper, the Levant supplied timber and glass. Assyria and Babylon watched from the east, powerful in their own right. Diplomacy held this world together as much as armies did. Allied courts exchanged letters, gifts, and daughters in marriage. A shipwreck discovered off the coast of Uluburun in southern Turkey, dated to around 1300 BCE, reveals just how far these trade networks reached. Its cargo included copper from Cyprus, tin possibly from as far as Afghanistan, ebony from Africa, and amber from the Baltic. This was not a primitive world, it was globalized in every sense the Bronze Age could achieve. People living in 1200 BCE had every reason to believe their world was permanent. Palaces were being expanded, trade was flourishing, armies were strong. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, scribes maintained vast clay tablet archives recording laws, treaties, and religious rituals stretching back generations, the paperwork of an empire that expected to still exist 100 years later. In the Mycenaean palace at Pylos, administrators tracked grain shipments, textile production, and temple offerings on clay tablets so detailed that modern historians can reconstruct the palace's entire economy from the fragments that survived its destruction. This was a world confident enough to build without fear. Palace walls were painted with scenes of hunting and feasting, not fortification. Trade agreements assumed decades of stability, not months. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests anyone saw the collapse coming. Nothing suggested that within a single generation, almost all of it would be gone. That's what makes what happened next so shocking. The first cracks appear quietly. A city here destroyed, a trade shipment there that never arrives. Then the pace accelerates. Ugarit, a wealthy trading hub on the Syrian coast, is destroyed and never rebuilt. Archaeologists have found a letter baked hard in the fire that ended the city, written by its king to an ally, pleading for ships and soldiers because enemy vessels had been sighted off the coast. The letter was never answered. Ugarit fell before help could arrive. Hattusa, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, is abandoned, not looted for treasure, abandoned. The royal archives, the military records, the seat of an empire that had rivaled Egypt for centuries, simply go dark. The Hittite Empire, one of the superpowers of the ancient world, ceases to exist within a matter of years. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, burn one after another. The elaborate bureaucratic writing system used to manage these palace economies, known as Linear B, disappears along with them. Greece plunges into what historians actually call a Dark Age, a period so poorly documented that literacy seems to vanish for centuries. This is not one war. It's not one army sweeping through one region. This destruction spans thousands of miles, from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant to the edges of Egypt itself. Something is moving through the ancient world, and it isn't stopping at any single border. And in the middle of this unraveling, Egyptian sources start naming a threat unlike anything they'd recorded before.
The most detailed account of this threat comes from Egypt, carved on the walls of a mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, near modern Luxor. The pharaoh is Ramesses III, ruling in the early 12th century BCE. On these temple walls, his scribes record a battle against a coalition of enemies attacking from the sea and by land. The Egyptians name several distinct peoples within this coalition, groups like the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Modern historians grouped these names together under a single label that the ancient Egyptians themselves never actually used: the Sea Peoples. The reliefs at Medinet Habu are dramatic. They show ships locked in combat, warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, and most tellingly, entire families, women, children, ox carts loaded with belongings moving alongside the fighters. This detail has fascinated historians for generations. Armies don't usually bring their families into battle. Migrations do. But here's the problem. The Egyptian inscriptions are propaganda, carved to glorify Ramesses III's victory. They tell us who attacked and that Egypt won. They don't tell us where these people came from, why they were moving, or what happened to them afterward. Some of the names, like the Peliset, are widely believed to connect to the Philistines, who later settle along the coast of Canaan. Others remain frustratingly difficult to trace to any specific homeland. There's another wrinkle. The Egyptian account of this battle isn't the first time the Sea Peoples appear in the historical record. Decades earlier, under Ramesses III's predecessor Merneptah, Egyptian inscriptions already mention several of the same group names fighting alongside Libyan forces attempting to invade the western Nile Delta. That means whoever these groups were, they weren't a single sudden storm that appeared out of nowhere in one dramatic year. They were already moving through the eastern Mediterranean for at least a generation before the Sea People's name enters the story most people know. A slow building pressure, not a single strike. So we're left with fragments, a named threat that appears in the record more than once, over more than one generation, a dramatic battle, and a silence surrounding almost everything else. Which is exactly why, for more than a century, historians have argued fiercely about what this evidence actually means. The traditional theory, popular for much of the 20th century, cast the Sea Peoples as an organized confederation of seaborne raiders sweeping across the Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms one after another. It's a compelling image, but many historians now consider it too simple and too reliant on taking Egyptian propaganda at face value. A second theory reframes them as refugees. In this view, the Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the collapse, they were among the earliest victims. As drought, earthquakes, and famine destabilized the eastern Mediterranean, entire populations may have been forced from their homelands, moving in search of food and safety, sometimes fighting to survive along the way. The presence of women and children in the Medinet Habu reliefs fits this theory well. A third theory points to mercenaries. Bronze Age armies, including Egypt's own, are known to have employed foreign fighters from exactly these same regions. Sheridan warriors served in Ramesses II's own bodyguard decades earlier. Under this theory, some of the Sea Peoples may have been soldiers whose employers collapsed, leaving them to fend for themselves, sometimes turning against the very kingdoms that once paid them. A fourth theory emphasizes climate. Tree ring and pollen data from the period suggest a prolonged drought gripped the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Pollen cores taken from lake beds in Cyprus and the Levant show a sharp decline in cultivated crops during exactly this window, consistent with years of failed harvests stacking on top of one another. If harvests failed across multiple kingdoms simultaneously, migration and conflict may not be deliberate invasion, but more a desperate scramble for survival. Entire communities uprooting themselves not to conquer new land, but because the land they already had could no longer feed them. None of these theories fully explains the evidence on its own. A pure invasion theory struggles to explain why families would travel with an invading army. A pure refugee theory struggles to explain the scale and coordination of the attacks Egypt describes. A pure mercenary theory struggles to explain why groups with no prior loyalty to each other would suddenly act as a unified coalition. Most historians today favor a combination of these explanations, not a single cause, but a chain reaction. Climate stress triggers famine. Famine triggers migration and unrest. Unrest disrupts trade. Disrupted trade weakens governments that already depend on imported resources like tin, without which bronze itself cannot be made. Cut that supply line, and weapons, tools, and the entire military technology of the era is at risk. Layer onto this the internal power struggles simmering in several of these kingdoms, and warfare that may have already been draining resources before the Sea Peoples ever appear in the record, and a portrait emerges of civilizations that were already fracturing under pressure from multiple directions at once. Some historians describe this as a systems collapse, a situation where several fragile, interdependent systems fail at once, and each failure accelerates the others. Trade collapse leads to resource shortages. Resource shortages lead to political instability. Political instability leads to weaker armies and broken alliances. Weaker armies and broken alliances leave kingdoms unable to respond when the next disaster strikes, whether that disaster is a drought, an earthquake, or a fleet of ships appearing on the horizon. It's a slow unraveling that from a distance looks sudden. The Sea Peoples didn't need to conquer a healthy, thriving world. They arrived as invaders, refugees, or mercenaries, or all three, at the exact moment that world was already buckling under its own weight. Which brings the story to its most famous confrontation, the moment Egypt, alone among the Bronze Age superpowers, actually held the line. By the time the coalition of Sea Peoples reaches Egypt's borders, the Hittite Empire is already gone. Ugarit is already ash. Mycenaean Greece is already burning. Egypt is, in a very real sense, facing a threat that has already destroyed every other major power in the region. Ramesses III prepares on two fronts. Egyptian records describe a land battle fought near the border and a naval battle fought in the Nile Delta sometime around 1175 BCE. The Battle of the Delta is one of the earliest naval battles recorded in detail anywhere in history. The Medinet Habu reliefs depict Egyptian archers lining the riverbanks, raining arrows down onto enemy ships trapped in the delta's narrow channels, while Egyptian vessels close in to finish the fight in hand-to-hand combat. According to the inscriptions, the invading fleet is destroyed. Egypt survives. But survival comes at a cost. Even victorious, Egypt emerges from this period visibly weakened, its treasury strained, its influence over former territories in the Levant fading, and within a few generations, the new kingdom's power in serious decline. Egypt won the battle that toppled everyone else in the region. It's not clear that it truly won the war against the forces reshaping the entire Mediterranean world. In the wake of this collapse, some civilizations vanish entirely from history. Others survive only as fragments and legends, remembered centuries later in half-mythologized form, including, some scholars argue, in the epics that would eventually become Homer's Iliad and Odyssey.
the Eastern Mediterranean enters what historians call a dark age. Smaller settlements, reduced literacy, and centuries before palace-scale civilization returns in the same form. Some groups associated with the Sea Peoples do settle down. The Peliset appear to become the Philistines of the biblical Levant, giving their name eventually to the region we still call Palestine. Others fade from the record entirely, their origins as mysterious as their fate. More than 3,000 years later, we still cannot say with certainty who the Sea Peoples really were. Invaders, refugees, mercenaries, or some shifting combination of all three, swept up in a crisis none of them fully controlled. The evidence is fragmentary, the inscriptions are propaganda, the archaeology is scattered across a dozen countries and 100 excavation sites, each adding a piece to a puzzle that has never been completed. New evidence still surfaces. Every few years, an excavation in Cyprus, Turkey, or the Levant adds a new layer of destruction debris, a new burned archive, a new radiocarbon date that shifts the timeline by a decade in one direction or another. Each discovery narrows the mystery slightly, and just as often, complicates it further. Some scholars now believe there may not have been a single coordinated migration at all, but several unrelated crises that ancient Egyptian scribes lumped together under one convenient label, because to the people living through it, it must have felt like the entire world was ending at once. And maybe that's exactly why this story still pulls people in, because it isn't really about one mysterious people at all. It's about how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be. How trade routes, harvests, and political stability can all be connected in ways no one fully sees until they start to fail. It's a reminder that history's greatest collapses rarely have a single cause or a single villain. The Bronze Age world believed it would last forever. It didn't. And somewhere in the ashes of that collapse, a name was carved into a temple wall. A name we still can't fully explain.